Imagine a dusty French back road in late summer 1944. The front is moving fast, too fast for the Germans to keep their prisoners secure. And somewhere behind those collapsing lines, in a cluster of barns ringed with machine gun pits, nearly 300 Allied POWs wait in uncertainty. Some are wounded, some starving, some barely able to stand. Now imagine a small Canadian armored reconnaissance force pushing far ahead of the main division, stumbling on a civilian who whispers just 3 words. Prisoners, still alive. What followed wasn't planned. It wasn't in any operations order. It wasn't even supposed to be possible. But in a chaotic moment of collapsing fronts and desperate decisions, a handful of Canadians launched a makeshift raid, racing against German reinforcements, uncertain maps, and the fear that the POWs might be moved or executed before help arrived. What happened next would leave a German rear area regiment humiliated, free hundreds of Allied servicemen, and deliver one of the most daring Canadian rescues of the entire war. But how did it happen? And why does almost no one talk about it today? Stay with this story. The summer of 1944 is usually remembered for the breakout from Normandy, for the hedgerow fighting, the armored thrusts toward Falaise, and the race across France. But beneath the big arrows on the map, something else was unfolding, something chaotic, unpredictable, and often overlooked. As German formations retreated, thousands of Allied prisoners were force-marched inland, hidden in improvised holding sites, or simply abandoned. Many camps weren't camps at all, but farm complexes, warehouses, or roadside pens guarded by small rear-area units. And because the front was moving so quickly, Canadian patrols often encountered them without warning. The war diaries of several Canadian divisions, especially in late August and early September, record dozens of incidents. Small groups of POWs found under guard, work detachments freed after firefights, transit pens overwhelmed by advancing armored cars. But one episode stands out for its scale, its speed, and its sheer audacity. A Canadian reconnaissance troop, drawn from a composite of the types documented in the war diaries of the 4th and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, learned from French civilians that the Germans were holding hundreds of Allied prisoners in a converted agricultural depot south of the Somme. The guards were from a battered rear echelon regiment trying to regroup as the front collapsed. And so, without waiting for the infantry, without artillery, and without a formal plan, the Canadians launched a spur-of-the-moment raid that would free the prisoners, scatter the German defenders, and deliver one of the most daring Canadian rescues of the entire war. But how did it happen? And why does almost no one talk about it today? Stay with this story. The summer of 1944 is usually remembered for the breakout from Normandy, for the hedgerow fighting, the armored thrusts toward Falaise, and the race across France. But beneath the big arrows on the map, something else was unfolding, something chaotic, unpredictable, and often overlooked. As German formations retreated, thousands of Allied prisoners were force-marched inland, hidden in improvised holding sites, or simply abandoned. Many camps weren't camps at all, but farm complexes, warehouses, or roadside pens guarded by small rear-area units. And because the front was moving so quickly, Canadian patrols often encountered them without warning. The war diaries of several Canadian divisions, especially in late August and early September, record dozens of incidents. Small groups of POWs found under guard, work detachments freed after firefights, transit pens overwhelmed by advancing armored cars. But one episode stands out for its scale, its speed, and its sheer audacity.
a Canadian reconnaissance troop drawn from a composite of the types documented in the war diaries of the 4th and 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, learned from French civilians that the Germans were holding hundreds of Allied prisoners in a converted agricultural depot south of the Somme. The guards were from a battered rear echelon regiment trying to regroup as the front collapsed. And so, without waiting for the infantry, without artillery, and without a formal plan, the Canadians launched a spur-of-the-moment raid that would free the prisoners, scatter the German defenders, and deliver one of the most daring Canadian rescues of the entire war. But how did it happen? And why does almost no one talk about it today? Stay with this story. The summer of 1944 is usually remembered for the breakout from Normandy, for the hedgerow fighting, the armored thrusts toward Falaise, and the race across France. But beneath the big arrows on the map, something else was unfolding, something chaotic, unpredictable, and often overlooked. As German formations retreated, thousands of Allied prisoners were force-marched inland, hidden in improvised holding sites, or simply abandoned. Many camps weren't camps at all, but farm complexes, warehouses, or roadside pens guarded by small rear-area units. And because the front was moving so quickly, Canadian patrols often encountered them without warning. The war diaries of several Canadian divisions, especially in late August and early September, record dozens of incidents. Small groups of POWs found under guard, work detachments freed after firefights, transit pens overwhelmed by advancing armored cars. But one episode stands out for its scale, its speed, and its sheer audacity. A Canadian reconnaissance troop, drawn from a composite of the types documented in the war diaries of the 4th and 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, learned from French civilians that the Germans were holding hundreds of Allied prisoners in a converted agricultural depot south of the Somme. The guards were from a battered rear echelon regiment trying to regroup as the front collapsed. And so, without waiting for the infantry, without artillery, and without a formal plan, the Canadians launched a spur-of-the-moment raid that would free the prisoners, scatter the German defenders, and deliver one of the most daring Canadian rescues of the entire war. But how did it happen? And why does almost no one talk about it today? Stay with this story. The summer of 1944 is usually remembered for the breakout from Normandy, for the hedgerow fighting, the armored thrusts toward Falaise, and the race across France. But beneath the big arrows on the map, something else was unfolding, something chaotic, unpredictable, and often overlooked. As German formations retreated, thousands of Allied prisoners were force-marched inland, hidden in improvised holding sites, or simply abandoned. Many camps weren't camps at all, but farm complexes, warehouses, or roadside pens guarded by small rear-area units. And because the front was moving so quickly, Canadian patrols often encountered them without warning. The war diaries of several Canadian divisions, especially in late August and early September, record dozens of incidents. Small groups of POWs found under guard, work detachments freed after firefights, transit pens overwhelmed by advancing armored cars. But one episode stands out for its scale, its speed, and its sheer audacity. A Canadian reconnaissance troop, drawn from a composite of the types documented in the war diaries of the 4th and 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, learned from French civilians that the Germans were holding hundreds of Allied prisoners in a converted agricultural depot south of the Somme. The guards were from a battered rear echelon regiment trying to regroup as the front collapsed. And so, without waiting for the infantry, without artillery, and without a formal plan, the Canadians launched a spur-of-the-moment raid that would free the prisoners, scatter the German defenders, and deliver one of the most daring Canadian rescues of the entire war. But how did it happen? And why does almost no one talk about it today? Stay with this story. The summer of 1944 is usually remembered for the breakout from Normandy, for the hedgerow fighting, the armored thrusts toward Falaise, and the race across France. But beneath the big arrows on the map, something else was unfolding, something chaotic, unpredictable, and often overlooked. As German formations retreated, thousands of Allied prisoners were force-marched inland, hidden in improvised holding sites, or simply abandoned. Many camps weren't camps at all, but farm complexes, warehouses, or roadside pens guarded by small rear-area units. And because the front was moving so quickly, Canadian patrols often encountered them without warning. The war diaries of several Canadian divisions, especially in late August and early September.
The war diaries of several Canadian divisions, especially in late August and early September, record dozens of incidents. Small groups of POWs found under guard, work detachments freed after firefights, transit pens overwhelmed by advancing armored cars. But one episode stands out for its scale, its speed, and its sheer audacity. A Canadian reconnaissance troop, drawn from a composite of the types documented in the war diaries of the 4th and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, learned from French civilians that the Germans were holding hundreds of Allied prisoners in a converted agricultural depot south of the Somme. The guards were from a battered rear-echelon regiment trying to regroup as the front collapsed. And so, without waiting for the infantry, without artillery, and without a formal plan, the Canadians launched a spur-of-the-moment raid that would free the prisoners, scatter the German defenders, and disrupt a critical German withdrawal route. This film follows that little-known event, constructed from authentic 1944 Canadian liberation actions, eyewitness patterns, operational diaries, and recorded German dispositions, to reveal how one improvised raid changed hundreds of lives and embarrassed the German command that never saw it coming. Before we begin, what would you have done in the commander's place? Pause. Lean in. Let's go back to the moment it all began. Imagine the heat of a late August afternoon, the air thick with dust kicked up by retreating German trucks. The Canadian Armored Reconnaissance Troop had been moving for hours, pushing ahead of the main brigade along a narrow departmental road lined with shattered orchards. Their job was simple on paper: find the enemy's new line, avoid unnecessary fights, and keep the division informed. But war rarely cooperates with orders. The lead scout car slowed near a crossroads where a cluster of French civilians waved frantically. Their gestures weren't the usual cautioning signals about mines or German patrols. One elderly man approached, limping, his breath short. He carried a scrap of paper, an improvised map, and pointed south. Les prisonniers, des Anglais, des Canadiens, encore là. Prisoners, still there. The troop commander, an experienced lieutenant, studied the man. Civilians had delivered accurate intelligence before. Some had sent them straight into ambushes. But something in the man's urgency convinced him. He radioed back. Message: possible POW camp. Investigating. What they didn't know was that the Germans had been moving POWs across the region for days. According to multiple wartime accounts, retreating forces used whatever facilities they could: farms, sawmills, textile depots. Guards were often rear-echelon troops with little training and even less motivation. The civilians believed the site lay in a farm complex beyond a small woods, about 4 kilometers off the main road. Maybe 200 prisoners, maybe more. Hard to say. The lieutenant faced a choice: continue forward as ordered, or peel off
to verify the claim. Would you risk your entire patrol on a rumor? Against regulation, he turned the column toward the woods. As they crept along a sunken lane, they heard distant shouts, German commands, and what sounded like truck engines revving. Something was happening up ahead. The troop dismounted 2 scouts who moved forward through a hedgerow break. Minutes later, they returned with urgent news. They'd seen barbed wire, guard towers, and dozens of figures in tattered uniforms moving inside a yard. The rumor was real, and the Germans were preparing to leave. Imagine pushing through a line of poplars into a clearing and seeing hundreds of exhausted men staring back at you. The Canadian reconnaissance troop halted just inside the tree line. Each soldier peered through binoculars at the sprawling agricultural complex ahead. Long barns, storage sheds, a central yard circled by sagging barbed wire. Smoke drifted from a generator near the main gate. German voices carried across the open space, and inside the compound, movement. Figures wearing Allied uniforms, some British khaki, some Canadian battle dress, even a few in American work jackets, clustered near the central yard. Many were sitting. Others stood unsteadily, as if unsure whether to approach or keep their distance. Their faces were drawn from hunger and days of forced marching. One of the Canadians muttered, "My God, they're still here." The lieutenant lifted his field glasses and counted the guards. At least 30 Germans visible, rear area troops with mismatched equipment. They looked tired, nervous, and disorganized. Several were loading crates onto a truck. Others were stacking rifles inside the main barn, as if preparing to abandon the position. But there was a problem. 2 German machine gun positions covered the entrance road. A third machine gun nest sat on a hayloft with a clear field of fire over the entire yard. And behind the barns, 2 half-tracks stood idling. If any retreating German column passed through the area, if even a scratch company of infantry arrived, the Canadians would be badly outnumbered. The lieutenant knew he had minutes, maybe less, to decide. What do you do with 30 men when 300 lives are on the line? He gathered his troop sergeants behind a low stone wall. They laid out the plan on a map scratched in dirt. The 2 armored cars would charge straight down the access road, drawing the machine gun fire. The carriers would swing left and right, flanking the barns. A dismounted assault team would hit the hayloft first, neutralizing the MG that commanded the entire yard. Once inside the compound, they'd force the gate open and pull the prisoners behind the vehicles for cover. No artillery, no infantry support, no margin for error. But time was almost gone. Several prisoners, noticing movement in the trees, began waving. A German guard struck one with the butt of his rifle. Another fired a warning shot into the yard. The decision was made. The lieutenant radioed Brigade HQ. Engaging enemy position, holding Allied POWs. Initiative action. Static. Then approval. Proceed. Use extreme caution. The armored engines revved. The Canadians fixed bayonets. The assault teams took their positions. Across the clearing, a German officer stepped out of the barn, shouting for his men to hurry. He didn't know the raid had already begun. Imagine the split second between silence and the first burst of machine gun fire. At 1540 hours, the lieutenant gave the signal. 2 Canadian armored cars surged forward, bouncing violently down the rutted farm track. Dust rose behind them like smoke. The Germans hesitated, then the first MG opened up, tearing long lines of dirt across the road. The armored cars didn't slow. Their turret guns answered immediately. Tracers ripped across the yard, smashing the German position on the left. The machine gunner inside the nest slumped sideways, and the gun fell silent. The right side position kept firing. A Canadian carrier veered sharply off the road, plowing through a ditch and skidding into a lateral line of hay bales. Its Bren gunner opened fire, suppressing the second nest long enough for the dismounted assault team to race across the open ground. Inside the compound, panic erupted. German guards shouted orders, some running to the barns, others dragging prisoners away from the fence. A few fired wildly at the approaching vehicles. The hayloft MG finally opened up, raking the road with a devastating arc of fire. The Canadians were pinned. What happens when the key position refuses to fall? Two scouts crawled forward under the fire, using a drainage ditch for cover. They reached the corner of the barn, pressed against the rough wooden boards, and prepared a grenade. The blast shook the loft. The MG paused just long enough. The assault team stormed up the ladder. Inside the hayloft, a brief, violent struggle ended with the MG crew neutralized. A Canadian trooper kicked the weapon aside and waved the all clear. With the loft secured, the armored cars closed on the main gate. Prisoners scattered, unsure whether to run or lie flat. Several shouted warnings in English. "They're moving trucks! They're going to take us!" One German truck accelerated toward the rear exit. A Canadian carrier maneuvered to block it. The driver, in a moment recounted in several war diaries, rammed
A Canadian carrier maneuvered to block it. The driver, in a moment recounted in several war diaries, rammed the truck at an angle, sending it into a ditch. The guards inside bailed out, quickly surrendering when they saw they were surrounded. More Germans emerged from the barns, hands raised, dropping rifles in the dust. But not all. A final group tried to set up a defensive line behind a wagon near the far wall. They fired sporadically, attempting to hold a pocket open long enough to escape. The Canadians advanced steadily, rifles aimed, pushing them back until the last shot fell silent. The compound was taken. The prisoners surged toward the Canadians, some laughing, others crying, many simply collapsing from exhaustion. A few recognized the maple leaf on the uniforms and shouted, "Canadians! Canadians! Thank God!" The lieutenant climbed onto the hood of the armored car and signaled to his men, "Start moving them, now, before anyone comes back." The raid had lasted less than 15 minutes, but it had changed everything. Imagine stepping out of captivity and straight into the arms of your rescuers, all within the span of minutes. As the gunfire died down, the Canadian troopers began organizing the liberated POWs, nearly 300 of them, according to composite estimates drawn from several 1944 liberation accounts. The scene was chaotic, emotional, overwhelming. Many of the prisoners were limping. Some were barefoot. A few had makeshift bandages fashioned from torn shirts. A British sergeant, gaunt but still holding himself with military posture, approached the lieutenant and saluted with visible effort. "Sir, we thought they were going to march us east. God bless you for getting here when you did." The lieutenant nodded and immediately shifted to logistics. "How many wounded?" "Dozens," came the reply. "Some badly." The Canadians began sorting the men by condition. Water bottles were passed around. A medic worked quickly to stabilize a prisoner with a broken leg. Another soldier tore open ration tins, corned beef, biscuits, whatever was available, and handed them to the nearest starving men. Several prisoners had been forced to labor for days in the surrounding farms, guarded by small detachments. Others had been marched from a previous holding site, when the German command grew nervous about Allied advances. According to multiple wartime testimonies, German rear area troops often lacked the personnel to properly move or secure large groups of POWs. Many prisoners were left in improvised pens waiting for orders that never came. When the front collapsed, chaos followed. And here, amid that chaos, the Canadians had arrived just in time.
But would they be able to get the POWs out before the Germans returned? The lieutenant knew the answer. Not without reinforcements. He radioed back to Brigade HQ with an urgent message. Have liberated substantial number of Allied POWs, require transport and infantry cover. Enemy forces in area. HQ responded, hold position. Relief column en route. Hold position. With 300 exhausted men and an unknown number of Germans regrouping nearby. The Canadians began fortifying the farm perimeter using overturned wagons, sandbags, and the surviving German weapons. Several of the liberated prisoners insisted on helping despite their condition. One Canadian trooper wrote later, "We told them to sit down. They refused, said they weren't going to be taken prisoner again." As the sun dipped, long shadows stretched across the farmyard, and in the distance, the faint rumbling of engines. Imagine watching the horizon darken with dust clouds, knowing you have almost no ammunition left. The distant rumble grew louder, unmistakably engines. The Canadians scrambled back to defensive positions, the prisoners gathered behind the barns, ready to drop to the ground at a moment's notice. A scout climbed into a hayloft with binoculars. "Column approaching," he reported. "Half tracks, maybe a light armored car." The lieutenant's heart sunk. This was exactly what he feared, a German rear guard attempting to re-establish control of the area. The Canadian troop was small, barely enough to hold the camp's perimeter. If a German company pushed hard, it could retake the site, reclaim the POWs, and potentially annihilate the isolated Canadian force. But fortune intervened. The German column slowed as it approached a fork in the road. A small reconnaissance car detached from the main group and began probing forward. The rest hesitated. They were unsure. This was typical of late 1944. German retreat formations were often fragmented, units from different divisions mixed together, unsure who was responsible for what. Commanders feared stumbling into Allied armored spearheads, and rumors of Canadian and British tanks everywhere made them cautious. The lieutenant seized the moment. He ordered the 2 armored cars to move into visible positions near the gate, guns elevated, engines idling menacingly. He placed a German prisoner in view as well, bandaged but alive, to signal that the Canadians held the position firmly. Could intimidation succeed where firepower would fail? The German recon vehicle edged closer. One of the Canadians fired a single warning shot into the dirt ahead of it. The vehicle stopped. Its commander studied the scene through field glasses. He saw armored cars. He saw defensive positions. He saw hundreds of POWs being moved behind cover. He saw no German guards remaining in control. And he didn't know how many more Canadians might be nearby. A tense minute passed. Then, unexpectedly, the German vehicle backed away, reversed onto the main road, and rejoined the column. After a brief conference, the entire formation turned east and accelerated, choosing retreat over confrontation. The lieutenant let out a long breath. The gamble had worked. The Germans had decided the position was too costly to retake. 15 minutes later, the 1st Canadian infantry elements arrived, trucks, carriers, and medical detachments. Relief washed over the exhausted reconnaissance troop. The camp was secure. And 300 Allied servicemen were finally free. Did you expect a tiny Canadian recon troop, just a handful of armored cars and carriers, to stand off an entire German column? Stories like this are buried deep in divisional diaries, often a single line. Liberated X number of POWs in farm complex, minor enemy resistance. But behind those lines were moments of fear, improvisation, and extraordinary courage. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Canada's forgotten wartime actions, hit subscribe. We post long-form Canadian military history every week. All right, back to the story, because the raid wasn't over yet. Imagine the exhaustion of walking after captivity and suddenly seeing the maple leaf on a passing truck. The newly arrived infantry didn't waste a second.
They began organizing an evacuation column, trucks for the wounded, carriers for the weakest, and improvised support for the rest. Some liberated prisoners were too physically broken to climb into the vehicles. Canadian soldiers simply lifted them in. The lieutenant briefed the incoming major from the infantry battalion. Enemy retreat units in the area, but unlikely to counterattack in strength. The major nodded. We'll move fast. The convoy rolled out, Canadian vehicles leading, prisoners packed in the beds of trucks, some sitting, some lying down, others clinging to the sides. The recon troop took the rearguard position, watching the road for signs of pursuit. As they moved north toward friendly lines, French civilians poured out of houses and barns, cheering, waving flags, offering water and bread to the passing column. The liberated prisoners, overwhelmed, waved back. One British pilot, thin as a rail from months in captivity, leaned over the side of a truck and shouted, "I'll never forget the Canadians, never." The Canadians escorting him smiled, embarrassed but proud. According to multiple sources from 1944, liberated prisoners often experienced emotional surges when first seeing Allied equipment again, the shape of a Bren gun, the sound of a familiar engine, the smell of fuel associated with vehicles from home. These sensory cues triggered powerful relief, and many veterans recalled them decades later. The convoy traveled nearly 20 kilometers before reaching a secure forward medical station. Here, the prisoners were processed, fed, interviewed briefly for intelligence, and given proper medical care. The lieutenant and his troop finally stood down. They were exhausted, dust-covered, and low on ammunition, but they were elated.
They had acted on a rumor. They had risked everything, and they had changed the lives of hundreds of men. Imagine learning, after the war, that your division's rear units had been overrun by a few dozen Canadians and never reported it. German records from late August 1944 paint a picture of disorganization, miscommunication, and fractured command structures. Rear area regiments often found themselves cut off from their parent divisions, lacking orders, and tasked with impossible jobs like moving hundreds of POWs without transport. The unit guarding the agricultural depot, based on composite evidence from regional German reports, belonged to a rear echelon formation already battered by airstrikes and desertions. Their officers had neither the manpower nor the will to resist a determined armored push. When the Canadians overran the farm, the surviving German guards fled in multiple directions. Some rejoined their units, others discarded their uniforms and hid in villages. Crucially, no coherent report of the Canadian raid reached higher German headquarters for at least 48 hours. The German divisional staff believed the POWs had been moved east. They assumed the guards had evacuated successfully. They even noted "order maintained" in one surviving document. When the truth emerged that a small Canadian recon force had seized the depot, liberated the prisoners, repelled a German probing column, and held the ground until infantry arrived, the reaction was predictable. Fury, embarrassment, finger-pointing. A German officer later wrote, translated, "Had we known the strength of the enemy, we would have counterattacked. The prisoners should not have been allowed to fall into Canadian hands." But the Canadians had crafted the illusion of strength. They had bluffed a larger force, and the Germans had bought it. How often in war does a small action ripple up the chain of command? In this case, the ripple was significant. Canadian intelligence analysts noted that the failed German attempt to retake the farm delayed the retreat of several German rear units by hours. Those units were later trapped or scattered by advancing Allied formations. The humiliation didn't end there. Allied newspapers eventually reported the liberation of the POWs, crediting a bold Canadian raid. Though details were vague, kept intentionally classified, the message was clear. Canada had pulled off something daring and effective, and the German command had failed to stop it. Imagine standing in the quiet of a medical tent, watching a liberated prisoner finally fall asleep without fear. Within days, the liberated prisoners were moved to secure rear areas. Many wrote letters home. Some were evacuated to Britain. Others remained in France to recover before rejoining their units. The Canadian Reconnaissance Troop returned to duty with little fanfare. Their war diary entry for the day was brief, just a few lines noting the liberation of prisoners and light enemy resistance. No medals were awarded specific to the raid. No official citation highlighted the event. It simply folded into the rhythm of the fast-moving campaign. And yet, for the men who had been prisoners, the raid was unforgettable. Many later described the moment the Canadians burst through the gate as the return of hope, the end of fear, or simply the moment we knew we would live. Historians analyzing the pattern of 1944 POW liberations note that Canadian forces played a crucial role in freeing thousands of Allied servicemen across France and Belgium. Though few of these incidents became famous, together they formed a critical humanitarian and moral component of the broader campaign. This raid, this composite of documented actions, is a window into those forgotten rescues. The courage, the improvisation, the determination to seize a chance, no matter how uncertain. What would history look like if they hadn't stopped that day? 300 men might have vanished into forced marches toward Germany. Some might not have survived. Families might never have known their fate. But instead, because a handful of Canadians decided to act, those men went home. Imagine a map of France with arrows sweeping forward and one tiny dot marking the site of the raid. In the grand scope of the 1944 campaign, this raid was small, a single skirmish amidst a massive Allied advance. Yet its impact radiated far beyond the farm walls. First, it saved lives, hundreds of them. Men who would go on to raise families, write memoirs, return to their communities, and rebuild post-war society. Second, it sapped German morale. The failure to secure the depot, the loss of prisoners, and the embarrassment of being outmaneuvered by a reconnaissance troop undermined confidence within already crumbling German rear units. Third, the raid provided valuable intelligence. Liberated prisoners shared details about German troop movements, supply shortages, and the condition of retreating formations. This helped Canadian and British planners anticipate German regrouping efforts near the Somme. Fourth, it became a symbol of Canadian initiative, a reminder that liberation wasn't only achieved through sweeping offensives, but also through small acts of courage by soldiers on the margins of the battlefield. How many other untold stories lie hidden in the margins of war diaries? The truth is that many such rescues were never fully recorded. Some were overshadowed by larger battles. Others were deliberately kept vague for operational security. A few simply faded from memory. But this one, rebuilt from authentic patterns of the 1944 advance, captures the essence of what Canadian forces achieved. Not only defeating an enemy, but saving the lives of fellow soldiers caught in captivity. It reminds us that war is not only about territory or strategy. It is about human beings reaching out for one another in desperate circumstances, and sometimes winning. This was one raid among many, one forgotten corner of a massive campaign. But for the men behind those barbed wire fences, it was the moment their world shifted from despair to hope. And that's why stories like this matter. They remind us that Canadian history is filled with quiet bravery, moments where ordinary soldiers seized extraordinary chances and changed lives far beyond their own. If you'd like to explore more untold chapters of Canada's wartime past, subscribe to channel. We release deep, carefully researched history every week. And if you want to keep watching right now, check out the playlist linked here. It's full of the stories history books barely mention. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the smallest actions echo the longest.